Imagine being 5 years old and already knowing exactly who you are supposed to become. No choices, no alternatives, no "what do you want to be when you grow up?" Conversations at dinner. Your path was decided before you took your first breath, written into your bloodline, sealed by your family name, and confirmed the moment you were placed in your father's arms. This was the reality for thousands of children born into Japan's warrior class, the Bushi, a group we know today by a much more famous name, the samurai. And their story doesn't begin on a battlefield. It begins in a cradle. So, who exactly were the samurai, and why did birth matter so much in their world? To understand that, we need to travel back to feudal Japan, a period stretching roughly from the 12th century all the way through the 19th. This was a world built on rigid social order, a world where the family you were born into wasn't just your identity, it was your entire future. Japanese feudal society was organized into a strict hierarchy. At the very top sat the emperor, a divine figure, though often more symbolic than politically powerful. Below him, the shogun held real military authority, acting as the supreme commander of the land. Then came the daimyo, the regional lords who controlled vast territories and commanded armies of their own. And beneath the daimyo, the samurai. These were the warriors who served, protected, and enforced the will of their lords. They were soldiers, yes, but also administrators, enforcers, and symbols of order in a world that was frequently chaotic and violent. Being a samurai wasn't a job you applied for, it was something you were born into. The Bushi class was hereditary, meaning that if your father was a samurai, you were a samurai. Simple as that. And if your father was a farmer, a merchant, or a craftsman, then no amount of talent, bravery, or ambition would officially make you one. This might sound harsh by modern standards, and honestly, it was. But here's what's fascinating. Within that rigid system, there was a deeply human story unfolding every single day inside samurai households across Japan. Picture a home in a castle town, perhaps in the mountains of what is now Nagano, or along the coast near present-day Hiroshima. The house is modest but organized, built with clean lines, sliding paper doors called shoji, and tatami mat floors that require you to remove your sandals before entering. There's a small garden outside, carefully maintained, a wooden practice sword, leaning against the wall near the entrance. Inside this house, a boy, let's call him by a common childhood name of the era, Takichio, wakes before sunrise. He's 6 years old. He doesn't complain about the cold. He's already learning not to. From the very first years of life, samurai children were immersed in the values of their class. But it didn't start with swords or warfare. It started with something far more fundamental. It started with belonging. The concept of clan loyalty, clanship in its most visceral form, was perhaps the single most important thing a samurai child absorbed in those early years. Your clan was your identity. Your daimyo was your lord, your employer, and in many ways, your reason for existing. The relationship between a samurai and his lord wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal, almost sacred. Children learned this through observation long before anyone explained it to them directly. They watched how their fathers bowed. They noticed the tone of voice their parents used when the Lord's name was spoken. They understood intuitively that there were people in the world whose authority was absolute, and that respect toward those people was not optional. This wasn't blind submission exactly. It was more like an internalized code, a sense that the social order had a purpose, that every person in it had a role, and that fulfilling your role with excellence was the highest form of integrity. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Not all samurai were wealthy, not even close. Popular imagination often pictures samurai as noble, elegantly dressed figures living in grand estates, and some of them were exactly that. High-ranking samurai in service to powerful daimyo could indeed live very comfortable lives, with servants, fine clothing, and considerable social influence. But the samurai class was enormous. Estimates suggest that by the Edo period, samurai and their families made up somewhere between 5 and 10% of Japan's total population. That's hundreds of thousands of people. And the vast majority of them were lower-ranking warriors who lived modestly, sometimes barely above the economic level of the farmers they technically outranked. A low-ranking samurai family might live in a small house near a castle town, receiving a stipend paid in rice from their lord, enough to survive, not enough to be comfortable. The father would serve in an administrative or military role. The mother would manage the household with strict discipline, and the children, the boys especially, would be raised with an acute awareness that their family's honor was always on the line. That pressure? It started young, very young. There's a detail about samurai childhood that historians find particularly striking, and it speaks volumes about how this culture understood identity. Samurai boys were often given childhood names at birth, names that were considered temporary, used only until the boy came of age. These names were deliberately humble or even slightly inauspicious in sound, rooted in an old belief that boastful names attracted misfortune. A child called something that sounded ordinary or even slightly rough would, the thinking went, be watched over by fate rather than challenged by it. This name would be used throughout childhood, through all the years of learning and training and growing, and then, at a specific moment, a ritual moment we'll explore in detail in a later chapter, it would be set aside forever. The boy would receive a new name, an adult name, a warrior's name, but that transformation was years away. For now, Takachio finishes his morning routine in the cold, straightens his posture, because posture, he's already been told, is the first sign of a man's character, and steps into another day of becoming. He doesn't know yet what battles he might one day face. He doesn't know if he'll serve in war or spend his life managing rice records in a regional office. He doesn't know if the era he's growing up in will be defined by conflict or by a long bureaucratic peace. What he knows, what he feels in every fiber of his small body, is that he was born to serve, born to honor his family, born to carry a name forward through whatever the world throws at him, and that, in feudal Japan, was enough to get out of bed before the sun rose. Every single morning. Here's a question that most people never think to ask when they imagine a samurai. Before the sword, before the armor, before the battlefield, before any of that, what did a samurai read? Because they did read, extensively. And that fact alone tells us something profound about what feudal Japan actually valued in its warrior class. The samurai were not simply trained killers, they were expected to be educated, articulate, morally grounded human beings. A warrior who could not read, could not write, could not discuss philosophy or compose a poem, that warrior was considered incomplete. The sword was important, but the mind that held it, that was everything. Let's step inside a samurai household on an ordinary morning. Not a training morning, not a ceremony, just a regular day somewhere in the middle of the Edo period, perhaps around the early 1700s. The boy wakes early, as always. But today, instead of heading to the training yard, he sits cross-legged on a tatami mat in a quiet room. In front of him, a low wooden desk. On the desk, a brush, an inkstone, a small dish of water, and a sheet of paper. He picks up the brush, he breathes, and he begins to write. Literacy was not optional for samurai children. It was a foundation, as essential as physical strength, perhaps more so. And the system through which they learned to read and write was deeply tied to the Chinese written tradition, specifically through the use of kanji, the complex logographic characters that form the backbone of written Japanese. Learning kanji was not a simple task. Even today, a Japanese student must memorize over 2,000 characters just to reach basic literacy. In feudal Japan, the process was slow, deliberate, and demanding. Children began learning individual characters from a young age, copying them repeatedly until the strokes became instinct. But here's what made this different from simply memorizing letters. The act of writing itself was considered a discipline, a moral exercise. The practice of calligraphy, known as shodo, which translates literally as the way of writing, was never just about putting characters on paper. It was about cultivating the inner state necessary to produce something beautiful under pressure. Think about what that requires. To write a single kanji character with a brush demands steadiness of hand, control of breathing, clarity of focus, and the ability to commit fully to each stroke, because with a brush and ink, there is no erasing. Every mark you make is permanent. Sound familiar? It should, because those are exactly the qualities a samurai would need in combat. The training ground and the writing desk were, in the eyes of feudal Japanese culture, the same classroom. Beyond calligraphy, samurai education encompassed a rich intellectual tradition rooted primarily in philosophy, and the dominant philosophical framework was Neo-Confucianism. Now, before your eyes glaze over at the word philosophy, stay with me here, because this is where things get genuinely fascinating. Neo-Confucianism, as it was practiced and taught in feudal Japan, wasn't abstract theorizing. It was a practical guide to human behavior. It answered the questions that a young samurai boy would actually encounter in his daily life. Questions like, how do I treat my father? How do I speak to someone of higher rank? What do I owe my lord? What do I owe myself? The answers the philosophy provided were clear, consistent, and demanding. Obedience was not weakness. It was the recognition that social order required individuals to subordinate personal desire to collective harmony. A son obeyed his father not because he feared punishment, but because that relationship was considered one of the sacred bonds holding civilization together. Duty, the concept of giri, meant that every relationship carried obligations: your duty to your lord, your duty to your parents, your duty to your clan. These weren't burdens to be resented. They were the architecture of a meaningful life. Respect for authority wasn't blind compliance. It was the acknowledgement that experience, rank, and wisdom deserved deference, and that a young person who couldn't show humility toward those above him would never develop the character to be trusted by those below him. These ideas were woven into daily life with remarkable consistency. A boy didn't sit down once a week to study ethics. He lived it in how he greeted his parents each morning, in how he addressed his teacher, in how he responded when he was corrected or criticized. Now, it's worth noting that formal education looked quite different depending on when in Japanese history we're talking about. During the turbulent Sengoku period, the age of warring states, stretching roughly from the late 1400s through the early 1600s, Japan was in near constant military conflict. Education happened primarily at home, within the family, or under the direct supervision of a lord's household. The emphasis was practical and urgent. A father taught his son what he knew. An older retainer passed skills to younger ones. Formal schooling was a luxury that constant warfare made difficult to sustain. But then something remarkable happened. In 1603, the Tokugawa shogunate came to power and, slowly, then dramatically, the fighting stopped. Japan entered a period of enforced peace that would last over 2.5 centuries. This era, known as the Edo period, transformed samurai society in ways that no one could have fully anticipated. With no wars to fight, the samurai class had to reinvent its purpose, and education became central to that reinvention. Schools began to proliferate across Japan. The most widespread of these were the Terakoya, small community schools, often housed in Buddhist temples, that provided literacy education to children from various social classes. For samurai families, more specialized institutions called hanko, domain schools, offered rigorous academic and moral training tailored specifically to the warrior class. By the height of the Edo period, Japan had achieved literacy rates that were extraordinarily high by global standards for the era. Some historians estimate that literacy among samurai men approached near universal levels. Even among the broader population, rates were remarkably elevated compared to contemporary Europe. The samurai, often imagined as a figure defined purely by martial skill, had quietly become one of the most educated social classes in the pre-modern world. There's one more element of samurai intellectual education that deserves attention, and it's one that often surprises people. Poetry. Specifically, the composition of waka and later haiku, short, structured forms of verse that required the writer to distill an emotion, an observation, or a moment into the fewest possible words. Why would warriors be taught poetry? Because poetry demanded the same thing that calligraphy demanded, the same thing that philosophy demanded, the same thing that combat demanded. Presence, precision, the ability to hold a feeling without being consumed by it, and then express it with absolute clarity. A samurai who could write a composed, beautiful poem in the moments before a battle, or in the immediate aftermath of losing someone he loved, was demonstrating something far more impressive than physical strength. He was demonstrating mastery of self, and in feudal Japan, that mastery began not on the training ground. It began at a low wooden desk on a cold morning with a brush in a small hand, stroke by deliberate stroke. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this, a courtyard somewhere in feudal Japan. Dawn is barely breaking. The sky still the particular shade of deep blue that exists just before the sun decides to show itself. The air is cold, sharp, the kind of cold that makes your breath visible and your fingers stiff. And in the middle of that courtyard, a child, no older than 6 or 7, stands in a ready stance, feet apart, knees slightly bent, both hands gripping a wooden sword. He's been awake for over an hour already. His arms are trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of holding the position correctly after dozens of repetitions. His instructor, perhaps his father, perhaps an older retainer, watches in silence, waiting, evaluating every angle, every breath, every tiny adjustment the boy makes to his posture. Then, quietly, a single word, again. This was the reality of physical training for young samurai apprentices. And if there's one thing that historians who study this period consistently emphasize, it's this. The training was real, it was relentless. And it began far earlier than most people assume. We're not talking about teenagers picking up a sword for the first time. The physical education of a samurai boy typically began somewhere between the ages of 5 and 7. Some accounts suggest even earlier introductions, simple exercises, basic posture training, learning to fall correctly, happening as young as 4. Why so early? Because the body, like the mind, needed years to build its foundation. Flexibility, coordination, muscle memory, these things cannot be rushed. A samurai who began serious physical training at 15 was already, by the standards of his culture, significantly behind. The first weapon a young samurai apprentice ever held was almost certainly not a sword. It was a baken, a wooden sword carved to approximate the weight and shape of a real blade, but incapable of inflicting the kind of lethal damage that steel would cause in untrained hands. The baken was ingenious in its simplicity. It allowed a child to learn the mechanics of sword technique, the grips, the stances, the cutting angles, the footwork, without the catastrophic risk of serious injury that would come with a real blade. And yet it was not a toy. A hard strike from a baken could absolutely break fingers, bruise ribs, or knock a boy off his feet. It demanded respect. The discipline practiced with the baken was called kenjutsu, the art of the sword, and it was the absolute core of samurai martial education. Hours were spent on basic cuts, the same downward diagonal strike performed hundreds of times, until the motion was no longer something the boy thought about, but something his body simply did, until the movement lived in his muscles and his tendons rather than in his conscious mind. This principle, the idea that true mastery means moving beyond conscious thought into pure instinct, was fundamental to samurai martial philosophy. A warrior who had to think about his next move in combat was already too slow. The goal of all those thousands of repetitions in the training yard was to make thought unnecessary. But Kenjutsu was only one component of a much broader physical curriculum. Kyudo, the art of the bow, was another discipline that samurai apprentices trained in from a young age. Archery in feudal Japan was not simply about hitting a target. Like calligraphy, it was considered a path toward inner development. The archer had to achieve a state of complete physical and mental stillness before releasing an arrow. Breathing technique was paramount. Emotional control was mandatory. There's a concept in Japanese archery philosophy called zanshin, a word that translates roughly as remaining mind or sustained awareness. It refers to the mental state that a practitioner should maintain even after the arrow has been released. The action is complete, but the awareness does not collapse. The body remains composed. The mind stays present. Teaching that to a 7-year-old is, when you think about it, an extraordinary undertaking. And yet, it worked. Repeated over years and years of practice, these disciplines genuinely shaped the way samurai boys experienced their own minds and bodies. The training wasn't just building fighters, it was building a particular kind of human being. Then there was jujutsu, unarmed combat, the ancestor of what we know today as judo and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Jujutsu recognized a fundamental truth about real combat. Weapons can be lost. A sword can be knocked from your hand. An arrow can miss. A spear can break. What happens then? You use your body. Jujutsu training taught apprentices how to throw an opponent, how to use an attacker's momentum against them, how to break a grip, how to apply joint locks that could immobilize a larger, stronger enemy. It also included ground fighting, a domain that many martial traditions neglected, but which the Japanese recognized as absolutely critical when battles descended into close-quarters chaos. For young boys, jujutsu training often involved a great deal of falling. Learning to fall correctly, to receive the impact of the ground without injury, to roll and recover, and immediately return to a ready position was among the first physical skills they mastered. And that skill, unglamorous as it sounds, would save lives. For samurai from higher-ranking families, there was one more discipline that separated the elite from the merely competent: equestrian training. The image of the mounted samurai warrior, armored, commanding, controlling a powerful horse at full gallop while managing weapons, is one of the most iconic in Japanese history, and achieving that level of horsemanship required years of dedicated practice beginning in childhood. Boys from noble or high-ranking samurai families would begin learning to ride at a young age, starting with controlled walks and basic commands before progressing to the kind of skilled riding that warfare actually demanded. Mounted archery, firing arrows accurately from horseback while the horse was in motion, was considered one of the highest martial accomplishments a samurai could demonstrate. It was also extraordinarily difficult, and only a relatively small percentage of samurai ever truly mastered it. Now, here's something important that often gets lost in the popular image of samurai training. It was not all about aggression. Yes, the physical demands were intense. Yes, the expectations were high. Yes, failure was met with immediate correction, sometimes harshly. But the underlying philosophy of samurai martial training was not about producing the most violent person possible. It was about producing the most controlled person possible. Control of the body, control of breathing, control of emotional response under pressure, control of the ego when losing, and control of arrogance when winning. The physical training was, at its deepest level, a vehicle for the same inner development that calligraphy and philosophy were pursuing through completely different means. The training yard and the writing desk were once again the same classroom. A young apprentice who could hold a perfect Bakken stance for 10 minutes in freezing cold without fidgeting, without complaining, without letting his discomfort show on his face. That boy was learning something far beyond sword technique. He was learning what he was made of. And some days, especially in those early years when the wooden sword felt impossibly heavy and the stance made his legs burn and the instructor's eyes never seemed satisfied, some days that knowledge must have been the only thing that kept him standing. Again, always, again. There is a question that every young samurai apprentice, at some point in his training, must have sat with in the quiet of his own mind. Not a question about technique, not a question about history or philosophy or the correct way to hold a brush. A much more personal question: is this worth it? Years of cold mornings, years of falling and rising and falling again, years of holding emotions behind a composed face while the body ached and the spirit strained. Years of studying texts and copying characters and absorbing a philosophical tradition that demanded constantly and without compromise that the self be subordinated to something larger. Was it worth it? The answer that feudal Japanese culture gave to that question, the answer it embedded into the very bones of every samurai apprentice, was not delivered through words alone. It was delivered through a code, a ceremony, and ultimately through a life. Let's begin with the code. Bushido, the word translates most directly as the way of the warrior, was not a single written document that samurai consulted like a rule book. It was something more organic and more powerful than that. It was a living ethical framework, absorbed gradually over years of training and observation and lived experience that told a samurai not just how to fight, but how to exist. The core values of Bushido are worth examining individually because each one carries a depth that their simple translations don't immediately suggest. Meiyo, honor. In the samurai context, honor was not simply about personal pride. It was about the integrity of your family name, your clan's reputation, and your lord's standing in the world. Your honor was never entirely your own. It belonged, in a very real sense, to everyone who shared your bloodline and your allegiance. This meant that a single act of cowardice or dishonesty could cast a shadow, not just on you, but on your father, your brothers, your children, your lord. The weight of that collective responsibility was something apprentices internalized early and carried always. Chu, loyalty. This was perhaps the most sacred of all Bushido values and the one most distinctly Japanese in its character. Loyalty to the daimyo was not conditional. It did not evaporate when circumstances became difficult or dangerous. A samurai who abandoned his lord to save his own life had committed, in the eyes of his culture, one of the worst betrayals imaginable. The stories of samurai who chose death over disloyalty, who walked willingly into impossible situations because their lord required it, were told and retold precisely because they illustrated what loyalty, taken to its absolute limit, actually looked like. Courage. Not the absence of fear, which Bushido recognized as impossible and even slightly foolish to claim, but the ability to act correctly despite fear, to feel the body's instinct toward self-preservation and override it calmly and deliberately because duty demanded it. This distinction between the suppression of fear and the mastery of it was philosophically sophisticated in ways that are easy to underestimate. And then there was self-control, perhaps the value that touched every single moment of a samurai's daily life most directly. Emotions were not to be displayed publicly. Grief, rage, fear, even excessive joy, all of these were considered disturbances of the composed surface that a samurai was expected to present to the world at all times. This wasn't emotional numbness. It was emotional discipline. The feelings existed, they simply had no right to govern behavior. Woven through all of these values was the profound influence of Zen Buddhism. Zen entered samurai culture and never left. Its impact was not primarily theological. Most samurai were not deeply devoted Buddhist practitioners in any formal sense. Rather, Zen offered something that the warrior's life desperately needed: a relationship with death. Zen philosophy at its core confronts impermanence directly and without flinching. Everything ends. Every moment passes. Every life, regardless of how skillfully or honorably it is lived, concludes. The Zen approach to this reality was not despair, but acceptance. Not passive resignation, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement that the present moment is the only one that actually exists. For a samurai, whose profession placed him in regular proximity to violent death, his enemies, his comrades, and potentially his own, this philosophical framework was not abstract comfort. It was practical survival equipment. A warrior who feared death could be paralyzed by that fear at the worst possible moment. A warrior who had genuinely internalized the Zen acceptance of mortality moved differently, thought differently, fought differently. He was, paradoxically, more effective precisely because he had released his grip on survival as the ultimate priority. This acceptance was cultivated in young apprentices gradually through meditation practice, through the study of Zen texts and koans, and through the simple, repeated exposure to the idea that a good death, a death with honor in service to one's Lord, was not a tragedy. It was a completion. And then came the ceremony that marked the end of apprenticeship and the beginning of everything else. Genpuku. The Genpuku was the coming-of-age ritual for samurai boys, and it was one of the most significant moments in the entire arc of a young warrior's life. The exact age at which it occurred varied, typically somewhere between 12 and 17, depending on the era, the family status, and the individual's readiness. But its meaning was consistent across centuries and across social ranks within the samurai class. This ceremony was a threshold, a door. On one side of it stood a boy. On the other side stood a man. The ritual involved several specific, deeply symbolic transformations. The boy's childhood hairstyle, worn long or in a particular youthful style, was changed to the distinctive shonmeige, the adult topknot that would become one of the most recognizable visual symbols of the samurai. This was not a cosmetic change. It was a public declaration, visible to anyone who looked at him, that this person had crossed from one stage of life into another. New formal clothing was presented, adult garments appropriate to his rank and his lord's household. And perhaps most significantly, the boy received his adult name. That childhood name, the humble, temporary name given at birth to deflect misfortune, was set aside permanently. In its place, a new name was conferred, a warrior's name. The name he would carry into battle, into service, into history. And for the first time, he was permitted to carry real weapons, not the bokken. Not training equipment, steel. The katana and the wakizashi, the long sword and the short sword together forming the daisho, the paired blades that were the defining symbol of samurai status, now hung at his side. Their weight was different from the wooden practice sword. Not just physically heavier, though they were, but heavier in meaning, in responsibility, in the permanent, irreversible statement they made about who he was and what he was capable of. But what happened after the ceremony? What did the future actually hold for these young men who had spent their entire childhoods being forged into something exceptional? The answer, perhaps surprisingly, was it depended enormously on when they were born. A samurai apprentice who came of age during the Sengoku period, that brutal era of constant civil war, might find himself in genuine combat within months of his genpuku. The training would be tested immediately and harshly. Some of these young warriors died in their first engagements. Others survived and built reputations through decades of conflict. The path was violent, uncertain, and unforgiving. But a samurai who came of age during the long peace of the Edo period faced a completely different reality. With no wars to fight, the skills he had spent years developing had no immediate battlefield application. Many Edo period samurai spent their entire careers as administrators, managing domain finances, overseeing agricultural records, arbitrating local disputes, serving in bureaucratic roles that had almost nothing to do with the martial training that had defined their childhoods. Some became instructors, passing the physical and philosophical traditions of their class to the next generation. Some became scholars. Some, and this was considered among the most tragic outcomes possible, lost their lords through political upheaval, death, or the dissolution of their domain, and became ronin, masterless samurai, adrift in a society that had no clear place for warriors without allegiance. The ronin's existence was a kind of living symbol of everything Bushido feared. Without a lord to serve, without a clan's honor to uphold, without the relational structure that gave samurai life its meaning, what was a warrior? The question had no comfortable answer, and the ronin's wandering, purposeless life was seen as a kind of social death, even when the body continued breathing. So, what do we take from all of this? What does the life of a young samurai apprentice, examined closely and honestly, actually tell us? It tells us that one of history's most romanticized figures was, at his origin, simply a child. A child placed inside an extraordinarily demanding system, a system that asked him to sacrifice comfort, spontaneity, personal ambition, and emotional freedom in exchange for something that his culture considered far more valuable: identity, purpose, belonging. The samurai apprentice didn't just learn to fight. He learned who he was. He learned what he owed to the people around him. He learned that his individual life existed within a web of relationships and obligations that stretched backward through his ancestors and forward through his descendants. He learned that how you carry yourself in the ordinary moments, at the writing desk, in the training yard, at the dinner table, in the presence of your Lord, matters just as much as how you perform in the extraordinary ones. That's a remarkable thing to give a child, even if the giving of it was sometimes brutal, even if the cost was high. The samurai's world is gone now, dissolved by the modernization of the Meiji era in the late 19th century, the formal abolition of the samurai class, and the sweeping transformation of Japanese society that followed. The daisho no longer hangs at anyone's side. The chonmeji is no longer worn. The daimyo and their castle towns exist only in history books and archaeological sites, and the carefully preserved records that historians spend their careers decoding. But the questions that Bushido asked about loyalty, about duty, about the relationship between the individual and the community, about how to face mortality with composure and live with genuine purpose, those questions didn't disappear with the swords. They're still here, still worth asking, still in their own way, waiting for an answer.